Hi, I'm Liam Kelly, Senior Consulting Analyst with Elsoft International. Today we're going to talk about using dynamic queries and templates with our listserv lists. Dynamic queries are just a fancy way of saying that we take content from some external source, whether that's an LDAP directory or a database, and we use that as our subscriber list for a listserv list. So rather than what we might consider static content where listserv is managing the subscriptions internally, we're doing dynamic subscriptions where listserv is querying some external data source to fetch the subscriber list. With dynamic queries, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to execute any query, whether that's a SQL select statement or a search against some LDAP filter. We're going to be able to fetch our recipient list from that external data source, as well as any additional fields that we might want to retrieve from that data source. And we're going to be able to use those fields and that subscription list to populate content of a listserv posting. So let's take a look at a simple example. In our example here, I'm going to be using a SQL database, and I'll be connecting my listserv list to that SQL database to fetch information, and I'll be populating the bottom banner of my list template with information retrieved from that database. So first, let's take a look at what my database itself might look like. Alright, so here we see a simple table in MySQL. I have a user ID, I have an email address, and I have a username. Now, because we're mailing to a listserv list, the email address and the name are required. The user ID is an optional field that in this case I'm going to use to populate a bottom banner template for my listserv list. Now, the first thing I'm going to need to do is I need to configure listserv to talk to my database. In this case, I'm running listserv on Windows and I have a MySQL database running on Windows, so I'm going to configure an ODBC connector that listserv can access in order to access my MySQL database. If you were running on a non-Windows platform, you'd probably be doing this by way of an Oracle OCI connection or a Unix ODBC socket, but in this case it's Windows, so let's look at the ODBC connection. So here I'm looking at the Windows ODBC control panel. I've made a system DSN, I've called it test, I've used the MySQL driver for it, and I've configured my username, my password, and my default database name. I test that connection to make sure it works, it looks good, and so I should now be ready to configure listserv to connect to this system DSN. Okay, so we're now in the listserv control panel. I'm looking at my site configuration. I'm logged in as an administrator, and under the database tab is where I've inputted my ODBC connection info. I've defined the connection name, which is the same name as the system DSN. I've configured the username and the password that listserv should use to access that DSN. I also have an unnamed DSN, or one that's named default. Listserv always expects the default connection to be there. We can have anything that we want to add to that. We can have additional DSNs to connect to multiple data sources, but there should always be at least one called default, and in this case an additional one that I've named test. So looking under the site configuration now for DQL, what we have is a dynamic query. I've defined my dynamic query here as a DBMS query as opposed to an LDAP query. I've given it a server name, in this case test, which is the name of that ODBC connection that I made, and I supply a search string. The search string in this case is just a select that selects everything from my database. Now, it's probably useful to stop here and point out that just because I have a very simple example here where I'm just selecting user ID, email, and name from a table, things could be much more complicated than that. We could have any select statement we want. We can limit that with a where clause. We can have as many columns as we want to select from a database as we want. Anything that you can put into a select statement and feed to listserv you can use as a basis for a dynamic query. It's also useful again to point out here that while I'm doing this against a database, you could be doing the exact same thing with an LDAP filter. So if, for instance, we were connecting to Active Directory rather than a database table, we could supply a set of filters that we would use to select some subset of our directory and use that as our basis for our subscriber list. So the next thing we want to look at, we've set up our database table, we've defined an ODBC connection, we've defined the ODBC connection in the listserv configuration, and we've defined a dynamic query called test, which accesses that ODBC information and runs a select statement. The next step that we need to do is to configure one or more lists to use that dynamic query for their list membership. So let's take a look at that next. So now I'm going to look under my list management dashboard. I configure my DBMM test list, which is a list I've set up for testing, and I use the sublist keyword to define that query. So I say sublist equals query, and then in parentheses I put the name of the query, in this case test. If I go back and look at my list configuration or my list dashboard screen, you'll see that it still shows 0 subscribers. Dynamic queries work just the way that sublists do in listserv lists. In fact, they work by way of the sublist keyword when we're using dynamic queries for subscriber lists. So my list shows 0 subscribers. No one is subscribed directly to that list. I have no traditional list subscribers. What I have instead is a sublist, where that sublist is defined as some dynamic query. So what's going to happen when I post to that list, listserv will send to anyone who's subscribed directly to the list, in this case no one, but will also run the query and use the results of that query to fetch the additional subscriber list. So we have all the configuration done now. Listserv's ready to run this query. The next thing we need to do is let's check out our bottom banner template for the list so that we can use the results of this query to do something more interesting. Okay, so here I am under my list management menu, and I'm going to pull this down and I'm going to select the customization and the mail templates. And what I want to do to this list is I want to add a bottom banner that merges the user ID into the bottom banner of messages sent to the list. So I'm going to select top and bottom banners for my category. I've got my bottom banner for plain text postings, and here's the banner that's getting attached to the bottom of each message. Now I've got a line here that says your user ID is, and then I put ampersand user ID semicolon. Listserv is going to populate that with the contents of the user ID column that it's selected from the database in that dynamic query. Alright, nothing left to do but post our message. So let's look at the listserv message posting interface and we'll send this thing. So just to show off, we're going to use the listserv message posting interface. So I'm looking at my test list, I click post new message from the archives page, and here's my message editor. So I'll just supply a subject line, hello subscribers, and I'll supply the message text. And listserv is going to automatically put the bottom banner on this, and into that bottom banner it's going to automatically merge the user ID based on what it finds in the database when it runs this query. I click send message. Since my list is moderated, I've got to approve the message, so I'll go under list moderation. I see the message in the queue. I click on it. I see the bottom banner and I see where it's going to merge that user ID into the bottom banner. So I'll approve this message, and once I do so, it should be off to our subscribers' inboxes and they should receive a personalized copy. Alright, so here I've got the message in my inbox, and I'm going to open this up and take a look at what we've got. Hello subscribers, and we see there your user ID is 123456. So listserv has gone out, fetched my record from the database, populated it with my user ID, and dropped it into my inbox. So that's the quick overview of doing dynamic queries with listserv. We've set up a database table that contained user information. We set up an ODBC connection in the Microsoft ODBC control panel to access that database. We configured listserv in the site configuration to access the ODBC connector. We configured our dynamic query in listserv with the select statement that we wanted to run through that connector. We configured our listserv list and told it which dynamic query we want that list to run. We set up our bottom banner for that list to merge extra data from the database select into our list message, and then we posted the message off and made sure that the results worked. It seems like a lot of steps, but there are a lot of different things we could have done in each of those steps. We could have connected to LDAP rather than DBMS. We could have had any number of ODBC connectors. Listserv can connect to multiple data sources in parallel, multiple DBMS sources, multiple LDAP sources, or any mix of the two. For our SQL query, in this case, it was very simple and we used it only to fetch subscribers, but we can also use dynamic queries to do things like fetch a list of owners for a list, or fetch a list of moderators for a list, or who's allowed to post to that list. We can do that from LDAP data source or from a DBMS data source. We did something pretty simple with a bottom banner, just merging a user ID in there, but again, we could do a whole lot more with that sort of thing, with conditional blocks and evaluating database fields to include blocks of text based on whether certain database parameters are met or certain LDAP parameters are met. So this is a very simple example. I'd encourage you to check out the documentation that's linked after this video to see what else you can do with LISTSERV's dynamic query features. I've been Liam Kelly, Senior Consultant at LSoft International.